Next, we move on to the American System, which was written by Henry Clay, and it had three main points because any more people wouldn't have remembered it. The first one called for a protective tariff to raise funds and promote industry. The second point was roads and railroads, simple stuff like that, so people could get around, transport stuff themselves, goods. And the third point was a national bank to foster commons. Now, what happened during James Monroe's presidency was something called the era of good feeling. And it was a good era of good feeling because nothing was happening. We weren't really doing anything bad. People were generally feeling good. And so people were moving west, we were getting bigger, we were expanding, everything seemed to be good. And then came the Missouri Compromise. Now what happened was the North had 11 states, and the North tended to be more settled, they were more wealthy, which goes to show that slavery is bad, you should not happen. And then the South, which had slavery, also had 11 states, but they weren't as successful as the North. And Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state, but that would upset the balance in the Senate, or the balance at the White House between the North and the South, or the slave states and the free states. So they decided to draw a line through Missouri, and the states above, or the part above it, would be a free state, and the part below it, any states admitted below that line, would be slave states. So hopefully it was going to work out evenly. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was written, and it was kind of showing America. It had two main points. It was non-intervention and non-colonization, because Britain was trying to interfere with America again, and we just were like, no, we don't want to do that. You know, America was finally getting picked for the team, but they didn't want to be. They were finally a strong nation, and they just kind of wanted to do their own thing for a little bit, kind of settle down into their own shoes and just keep things going. So next we go to chapter 13, which it has to do with like a new democracy. So it's based on the universal white manhood suffrage. So you no longer had to own property to vote, but in the election of 1824, only a fourth of the eligible voters actually voted. So the election of 1824 was Andrew Jackson versus Henry Clay versus John Adams. Now, what happened was none of them got the majority, or 50% of the votes. So it went to the House, which Henry Clay was the main speaker of the House. So you obviously thought, well, he's going to make himself president. But what he did was he made a deal with John Quincy Adams so that John Quincy Adams would win as long as Henry Clay could be Secretary of State. So John Quincy Adams, following Thomas Jefferson, he was short, 7 inches thick. He was known as the least successful president. I mean, how would you like that as your title? He was the least successful president because of a few things he did, like the Tariff of Abominations. So the South did not like these tariffs because it made them have to buy from the North because the tax was so heavy if they wanted to import something. If Britain was making something for $1, the North can be making it for $1.25, but there's a 50-cent tax on the one from Britain, so they had to buy from the North because the tax was so bad. And everyone's just kind of mad at John Quincy Adams, and they did not re-elect him again. So, like father, like son, the Adams were only one-term presidents. So in the election of 1828, it was Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. It was like the popular kid versus the bully, or the popular kid versus the weak kid. So Andrew Jackson, he was the strong guy. He came in and he represented the men. He didn't graduate from college. He really had support from the South and the West because his energy was kind of showing the energy we had to move to the West. Now, Adams was more like the New England, like the olden days type stuff. And so, obviously, Andrew Jackson won. And he was tall and skinny, which they think is because of disease, and like I said, he had no college education, but when you think about it, a lot of celebrities nowadays don't have a college education. So he was definitely a fighting man. He got into a fight, and that's part of the reason people liked him, because he was a war hero. He used his veto axe a lot, and it was reasonable times that he used it, but he gained the nickname King Andrew. So next is chapter 14, which is the Jacksonian democracy. Now, a big issue in Jackson's presidency was the Bank of the United States, and Jackson just did not like the bank. And so Henry Clay, who was already kind of button heads with Jackson because he didn't have Adams win the presidency, his scheme was to recharter the bank, and if Jackson signed it, he would lose all his support and followers from the West, but if he vetoed it, then he would automatically have to lose the next election. So Jackson kind of made a statement why he vetoed it. He said it was like, he thought it was a bad idea, but it really wasn't unconstitutional. So it's more of his opinion. He wasn't really listening to, the Constitution like a president should do. But then the 1832 election, Jackson beat Clay by a lot. But the bank was still an issue. So you can't talk about Andrew Jackson without talking about the Trail of Tears. Now, Andrew Jackson honestly went into this with good intentions. He thought, he's just, nationalism, like us Americans, we're better than the Indians. He's like, this land is ours, and he thought, okay, we'll give you this land farther west. It'll be open, you can continue doing your stuff, but we're going to take your old land. And it ended up being awful, and thousands of people, died, and it was just awful. I mean, you think it's bad walking from your car to the front door in the cold, like, this was miles and miles of that. So, another issue arising was Texas. Now, Texas, the people in Texas do not want to be Mexican. They hated the government there, and so in 1836, they declared their own independence. And they kind of went into their own little revolution with Mexico led by Santa Anna, and they were defeated heavily at the Alamo, as everyone knows. Remember, the Alamo was one of the famous phrases used. But America did not really want to annex Texas because of the whole slavery issue, because Moses Austin had brought in 300 families from America. That's a thing he had signed with Mexico to kind of settle the Texas area. And they were slaves. They brought their slaves, and they wanted to be admitted as a slave state, but that would upset the balance. So, oh no, that can't happen. So, the birth of the Whigs Party happened during this time because they were just kind of random people. They're kind of the catch-all party, and they were solidified by their hatred for President Jackson, and that's why they soon ended, because Jackson eventually ended. So when Jackson was leaving the White House, he handpicked Martin Van Buren to be his successor, and Martin Van Buren won big at the Electoral College, but the popular vote was kind of not as big. Now, the difference between the Democrats and the Whigs is the Whigs were like, yes, government, big government, central government, and they wanted protective tariffs and a bank, and they wanted to abolish slavery and alcohol, so, some of their ideas were good. And then there are the Democrats that, they wanted to limit the government. They were like, yeah, states' rights, and that's what Jackson and Martin Van Buren were. So next we go into chapter 15, which is kind of like immigrants, immigrants, and more immigrants, which bring ideas, and more ideas. So America's population was booming. If you mix a high birth rate with young people, then you're gonna get a lot of people being born, because over half the population was under the age of 30 at this time. So they were gonna have kids. And you know what? You go out there, you get all this land, and the wife has nothing to do but have kids. It's kind of like this rabbit experiment they had in Australia, where they put these rabbits in this area with no predators and plenty of food, and they multiplied like crazy. That's kind of what was happening in America. Factories were also booming. Women could now work because they needed anyone they could get. So obviously they finally go to their last chase with the woman. This is kind of when birth rates dropped, because women were going to work, and they were no longer doing the job as being the wife and the caretaker. And so a lot of times women would work until they got married, and then they would take up the new work as being a mom and a wife. So America took a lot of their manufacturing plants from England, and that's kind of our import from England. Some inventions that helped during this time period to just expand and make things more efficient was John Deere's steer plow, and we still hear of John Deere today, which is how famous his invention was, the mower reaper, and the West was kind of starting to become above the South because of all the expansion and all the things they could do. Another very important invention was the steamboat. It meant they could go against the current now and things could go way faster. And also just general roads and railroads just to get around, transport goods and people. But at one point it was cheaper and easier to just go by boat than to go across a short period of land. People that were immigrating in were many Germans and Irish. The Irish potato famine caused many Irish people to come over to America. Like, they relied on potatoes for almost everything. It would be like if all the Wi-Fi went out in America, we would just leave and go to somewhere with Wi-Fi, which is what the Irish people essentially did with potatoes. And so they didn't have that much money and they were treated horribly, along with the Germans. The Germans were not treated very well, but they had more money, so they were able to buy land and they in turn were treated better. Even though they weren't treated the greatest, but the America did need their brains and their hands.